So I'm going to talk about the relationship between the economy and the environment. And in order to do that, in order to understand that relationship, you must understand how the ecology works and what happens with it over time. And you must also understand how the economy works and how it moves and changes over time. And that sounds very complicated, and it is. But what I'm going to do is argue that you can actually get the basics in 10 really very, not simple statements, but very straightforward statements. And the first one is that the economy is embedded in the ecology. And what that means concretely is that the economy is dependent on taking resources out of the environment, and it's also inevitably discharging its outputs into the environment. And this is unavoidable. That is, you wouldn't have an economy without taking resources from the environment. And it's not really possible to have an economy which doesn't discharge things into the environment. If nothing else, it discharges us into the environment. But this only becomes a problem when the behavior of the economy in taking resources and producing discharges threatens the basic functioning of the ecological system itself. And this brings me to my second straightforward statement, which is that there are planetary boundaries. If you want to look into this further, just Google 9 planetary boundaries. You'll come up with the Stockholm Resilience Center. They've identified 9. 3 have to do with boundaries related to how much you can take out of the environment, and the other 6 have to do with discharging things into the environment. The boundary is that point where the behavior of the economy starts to threaten the basic ecology. And so they ask what quantity can be withdrawn from the environment, what quantities can be discharged into the environment without threatening its basic function. The third straightforward statement is this fact limits the size of the economy. Statement number 4, 3 of the boundaries have already been crossed. 1 from the input side, which is the economy has been sucking in habitats essentially and has created massively unacceptable levels of biodiversity loss. The other 2 boundaries which have already been crossed are they have to do with discharge. One is the discharge of nitrogen and nitrogen pollution into our global waters, and the other, of course, we all know, is CO2, carbon dioxide. And the consequences of this carbon dioxide discharge are global warming. That's where we've already crossed the boundary. But CO2 discharge is also very important in terms of ocean acidification. We may not have crossed that ocean acidification boundary yet, but if we continue warming the climate, we'll eventually also have this other very serious problem. So the question of the size of the economy is immediate. The economy is already too large. It's already taking too much from the ecology and discharging too much into it in the form of nitrogen and CO2. This next statement is very important, and I've put it in italics up here on the board. Unlimited growth is impossible in a limited environment. And this is known as Herman Daly's impossibility theorem. Herman Daly is one of the original ecological economists. Unlimited growth is impossible in a limited environment. The dynamics of the ecology, again, are complex and cyclical, but basically bounded. The ecology can perhaps get a little bit smaller, but it can never get any bigger. Okay, we're stuck with what's here on the planet. The dynamics of the economy are also complex and cyclical, but the dynamics of the economy lead to unlimited growth. Okay, how does this happen? First, we need to specify what kind of economy we live with. And that economy is capitalism. Now, what is capitalism? Capitalism is not something we think about a lot because it's much like the air we breathe. It constitutes the economy. It's all around us. And we don't think about it too often. Basically, capitalism is an economic system where production is motivated by profit. So profit motivates decisions taken under capitalism. Why do the economic, political, and cultural dynamics of capitalism lead to unlimited growth? First, what do you do with your profit? Say you're a business, say you're a large business, say you're an oil company. What do you do with your profit? There are two possibilities, and the audience got both of them. One, you can give them to shareholders. Okay, you can consume your profits. But the other thing you do with your profits is invest them. And you end up investing most of your profits. If you've ever actually owned shares in a company, you know you don't actually get much of a payment. Most of these profits are reinvested. Why? Because corporations in a capitalist environment face competition. You've got to reinvest your profits in order to survive in a competitive environment. What do you invest your profits in? More machines, more workers, more sales, bigger markets, economies of scale. And if you invest wisely, what do you get? More profits. Now you have the problem over again. What do you do with those profits? You invest them. You invest them again in more machines, more workers, more markets. The individual capitalist enterprise must grow or die. If you add all of these individual capitalist enterprises together, the capitalist economy must grow or die. What happens to ordinary people when the economy ceases to grow? What are you afraid of? A little louder. Unemployment. Okay, you might think, well, the economy is ceasing to grow. Well, hell, that's good for the environment. Maybe we should be happy. But of course, we're not happy because we lose our livings. Okay, so that those growth dynamics are very essential to the way in which a capitalist economy functions. There's a single motive. That motive is profit and the reinvestment of profit. So capitalism leads to unlimited growth. It's the nature and logic of the system. It's not because any individual investor lacks morality or lacks foresight. It's not because the government hasn't regulated enough. It's in the nature of the system. One other point, profits depend, at least partially, on externalizing costs. Now, what does that mean, externalizing costs? What it means is if there are costs which exist outside of the enterprise, that is, the enterprise is depending, again, on drawing resources from the environment. If you're going to maximize profits, you want to pay as little as possible. The enterprise is depending on discharging things into the environment. If you want to maximize profits, you hope nobody notices and nobody charges you for it. So you won't find any momentum inside of profit-making entities to internalize the environmental costs. That is, to actually pay the price and then charge the customer.
They're socialized.
Yes, there are social costs to growth as well as environmental costs.
Those environmental costs
are
so
social
socialized.
costs.
It's the public pay for it.
Ah, right. Exactly. What you do.
Profits are privatized. The damage is socialized.
Exactly. Exactly. The next point. You can use profit to keep the pursuit of profit going. This is actually another use for profits. You can consume your profits, you can invest your profits, and you can also deploy your profits to make sure that that whole process of private investment, private profit, socialized costs continues. How do you do that? Well, you not only have a capitalist economy, but you also have capitalist politics. And we've been looking at a lot of different capitalist politics in the last couple of months in different parts of the world. There's a very close connection between business, politics, and the law, and that close connection is cemented by the deployment of profits to make those connections. In many ways, it's markets which regulate the state rather than the state which regulates the markets. You get the capture of government, you get the capture of expertise, wealth controls the media, wealth controls philanthropy, and there's a difficulty finding a purchase or a footing from which to oppose this process of endless capital accumulation. There's also capitalist culture, which is concentrated on the desirability of consumption. What we have is a manufactured consumerism. 12% of all retail prices are reinvested in marketing. So every time you spend your euro, 10 cents of that is going to come back at you in advertising. What does advertising encourage? More consumption, more growth, an increase in the size of the economy. You also have capitalist values centered around this notion of competition and individualism. In addition to capitalist politics and capitalist culture, you also have capitalist technology, which is why technology is not going to get us out of this problem. Okay, what do capitalists, by and large, what do enterprises invest in? Well, to date, they've been investing in environmentally damaging technology, fossil fuel dependency, toxic synthetic chemicals, nuclear energy, large dams, the production of waste. Most profit-motivated technological investment is oriented around saving labor. Okay, why would you want to save labor? You reduce costs. And one of the reasons why labor is a more important cost than anything else is labor is people, and people are problematic. You want to minimize the number of these troublemakers who are involved in your enterprise, except possibly as consumers. And what this means is that you become technologically increasingly dependent on the other things, the material inputs to the economic process. So you're constantly maximizing the throughput of materials and energy. And if you manage to actually save energy, here's an insight from standard economics. I'm not too big on standard economics, but here's one. It's called Jevons paradox. Jevons was a very prominent 19th century economist, and he made his reputation initially on writing about coal and the coal industry. And he observed that if you can invest in technology which saves you coal, what happens? You end up buying more coal. Why is that? Because you save money due to your investment. And where do you spend the money? You spend the money in expanding the coal-dependent economy of the 19th century. And the same is very much true today around oil, not so much coal. But it's very difficult in a profit-driven, in a growth-driven economy to actually save energy and input through technological investment. In addition, the rich are able to insulate themselves from environmental damage. You think, well, maybe rich people are affected by environmental degradation also. Maybe they'll come around and support the saving of the environment. It's much cheaper to isolate yourself from the problem. You can move away from it. You can live in gated communities. If the local water is polluted, you can drink bottled water. In fact, the local water is fine, and we're drinking bottled water here now. Not particularly good for the environment, I suppose. This raises the question of environmental justice. That is, the poor are generally hardest hit by environmental issues. Ultimately, you can't use current decision-making methods and expect that different decisions are going to result. I think it was Albert Einstein who defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The last of my 10 straightforward statements is that a steady state economy, an economy which does not grow, an economy which has a constancy of throughput of materials and energy, is the first step to sustainability. And the problem is that this goes against capitalist logic. No growth means no competition. This applies particularly to the well-to-do countries, one of which we live in. The top 500 million emitters of CO2, the top 500 individuals emit half of all greenhouse gases. That's about 8% of the population emitting 50% of the greenhouse pollution on a global basis. A US standard of living would allow the planet to support 1.4 billion people. There are a number of things a steady state economy cannot afford. And one of those things is constantly expending resources in the fight back against expansionary tendencies in the economy. If you manage to achieve a steady state economy, it would become important how you allocated the resources that you do produce in that steady state economy. And you can't afford to spend those resources constantly fighting capitalist tendencies to expansion. Another thing you can't afford is high levels of income inequality. This is one of the reasons why politicians are constantly going on about growth. Because if the economy is bigger, everybody can get a little more, including the well-to-do, including the poor. If the economy is no longer growing, the question of income distribution becomes immediate and personal. We've got to move away from a utopian reformism, a reformism which allows us to think about pushing reforms, creating fundamental change without challenging essential power relationships. Should we ignore more modest reforms? And the answer is absolutely not. The key question is, we must focus on what needs to be done. We need to focus on the science rather than on the limits of the system. We must be willing to push the system down to its bottom line and then be willing to cross it. The cultural critic Frederick Jameson has become famous for this statement: it's easier today to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Stop imagining the end of the world. Start to think about whether or not it's possible to imagine an ecologically sound economic system which is not founded on private profit and growth. Thanks.
Where this same system operates and where it's turned on its head is in the World War, where all of these rules go out the window and they just print money. There's any amount of employment.
Yes.
There's no, what's it called? It's like the normal rules that are suspended. But at the end of both World Wars, the world is plunged back into recession and they withdraw the capital that has been released. And it tells us that the world can operate a different system with money as a printable commodity, something that is a means of exchange, and have full employment. Not for war, obviously, to restore the planet's degraded ecosystems.
I'll just agree 100% with that.
I have a question. Collins put me recast this question. One thing I don't understand about when we talk about the economy and talk about the environment is how value is attributed to things.
Yeah.
Why, if we have a limited resource and limited boundaries to the economy, and oil, for example, is an example, phosphorus is an example,
Yes.
these are things that which can't be synthesized, they exist. There's a limited amount of them, and they're actually incredibly cheap given that they're limited. There's a limited amount of them. Why is the price of things which have a limited quantity at a global level so cheap in the global economy? Can you clarify?
That's actually a very profound question, which is debated extensively within both the economic profession and in the critics, and by the critics of the economics profession. I don't think that it's that important, actually. And the reason is that I think the ecology operates by its own rules. And those rules do not involve valuing bits and pieces of it. Okay? The economy is a system as a whole. And the key question is, how much of the various things are essential to keeping that system operating in its own terms? And that's a question of physical quantities in a certain sense, not how you would put a human value on those physical quantities. Within the human economy, we end up posing these questions. That is, how much is a chair worth versus how much is a computer worth? And in order to buy chairs, buy computers, produce computers and make a living, produce chairs and make a living, we have to answer those questions. I think the key question is not trying to put a value on the environment in the same way we put a value on a laptop. There are lots of economists on all sides of the issue, actually, who are trying to do that. The sort of conservative perspective is we should not overvalue the environment. We should value it and then pay for it, but not overvalue it. The environmentalist argument for the values is if we don't have a price on phosphorus, which reflects the importance of phosphorus both in the economy but also in terms of actually mostly pollution.
But who's to say what is value and what is overvalue?
Well, if you put a value on something, then you can say you can use it up to this point but no further. And the environmentalist argument is, well, if we put values on this stuff, we can make people aware that it's as important as the things we do put values on, like computers and chairs. But the problem is that the ecological dynamics pay no attention to those values, good, bad, or indifferent. You can't cross the planetary boundaries. And it doesn't matter what value you put on things. And especially in those really important things where we've already crossed. There's a lot of talk about putting value on CO2, and that would encourage people to restrict the amount that they produce if you taxed it. And I'm all in favor of taxing CO2. But I'm against saying that tax reflects the value, because we've gone way beyond calculation on this question.
One more question here.
I was just wondering about the whole thing about, it's almost like we're always pitting economics against environment, and it's
Yeah.
like never the twain shall meet. And I have a huge issue with that, because actually on a personal level you can save a lot of money the more ecological you think. You save money on petrol, you save money on food, on heating bills, if you suss out your house's energy losses. You save money on meat if you eat less meat because you know it's not as good for the environment. Less packaging, so you reduce your bills on your weight per weight for rubbish. And then also on a bigger level, that's personal, and then on a bigger level you see companies, if they look at their buildings and their heat loss and their management and all the different systems, there's so much waste are based on us being so busy making money we've forgotten to look at running our business in an ecological way. Like UCC just came on board with the Green Campus and they saved €100,000 in their first year. Because they looked at litter and waste and I just think we need to start saying that caring about the environment actually makes economic sense things, because people are so obsessed with capitalism and making profit.
Yeah, it sometimes does. I don't want to undermine your point, but I want to use the point to make a further point, I guess. And to come back to this Jevons paradox thing, where we've insulated our house recently to about the point where it makes sense to do so. It's an old house. It's still not very highly rated, but we're saving oil money on our heating bills. Well, if we went out and spent that money on a second holiday, it doesn't make any difference. What really needs to be done, I think, and this is a kind of narrow economist's point, but I think this one is, unlike a lot of other narrow economist points, I think this one is valid. That what you need to do is have a social infrastructure which makes it as convenient and cheap as possible to do the right thing, and makes it as inconvenient and expensive as possible to do the wrong thing. And at that point, you're not relying on people making sacrifices in order to save the environment. At that point, your daily life is just consistent with sustainability. And it's a political process that creates the infrastructure. Politics always creates economic infrastructure. It's never been any other way. Okay, where do the roads come from? Where does the electrical network come from? Where does the telecommunications come from? It comes either directly from government or with government subsidy. And so infrastructure, green, purple, yellow, whatever color the infrastructure is a political question. It's not a question of individual behavior, except as you put pressure on the political system to create that infrastructure. And if you're saving the environment, that pressure will save you money. If you're damaging the environment, that infrastructure would make your life temporarily just a little bit more difficult, but only temporarily.
So one of the things which is driving all this, all the need for growth, is over the last century especially, the fantastic rise in human population, which is competing in space for the biodiversity that we're all seeking to maintain, is a fundamental problem. And without solving human population growth, then we can all be super green, but if there's 3 times as many of us, then that's still a bigger load.
Yeah, I do take population growth seriously, not every left-wing environmentalist does. What I would observe just very briefly is if you were a Martian and you were an environmentalist Martian and you decided that there was too much population on planet Earth and you were going to cull it. You were going to take out 10% or 20% of the population. Which country would you go to first?
You go to all the countries with contraception.
No, you wouldn't go to the countries where the population is growing fastest. You'd go to the countries where the environmental damage per person is the greatest.
Okay, I'm going to have
But I'm not undermining your point. I'm just making another one on top of that.